My name is Claire Thompson. I'm 36 years old, but when I was just 17, my world collapsed in the span of a single night. I still remember my father's voice, steady and merciless. "You are not our daughter anymore." It was a crisp October evening, the kind where the air hinted at winter's arrival. I stood in the center of our marble-floored living room, clutching a trembling pregnancy test in my hand. My mother, Helen, looked at me as though I had dragged disgrace into her spotless house. "No daughter of mine would be so common," she whispered, her words colder than the night air. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He disappeared into my room, then returned with my suitcase, the one meant for college tours, and set it down by the door. His face held no hesitation, only finality. "You have 10 minutes," he said, adjusting the gold ring on his hand. "Take what you can carry. Leave the keys. 10 minutes." That was all I was given to erase 17 years of being their daughter. Have you ever felt something like that those who should have loved you the most were the ones who pushed you out? If this moment stirs something in your heart, I ask you to like this video or subscribe. Not for me, but so these stories can reach others who sit in silence tonight, wondering if they still matter. I pleaded with them. I promised to do better. But my father walked to the mantel and flipped the family portrait face down, erasing me with a single gesture. My mother examined her manicure as if my tears were an inconvenience. And then there was Ethan Blake, the boy I thought I loved, the one who had promised forever under the old oak tree at school. I thought he would defend me, or at least hold my hand. Instead, he blocked my number and vanished into the safety of his Stanford acceptance. His parents had money, lawyers, and expectations. His future mattered more than mine, or our child's. That night, I stepped into the darkness with only a suitcase, a necklace from my grandmother, and a heart torn between fear and fragile hope. The autumn air stung my face, but the sharper pain was knowing I had not just lost a home, I had been cast out of the very idea of family. That was the night my childhood ended. And though I didn't know it then, it was also the night a new kind of journey began, one that would teach me that blood doesn't always define family, and sometimes strangers carry the love our own kin refuse to give. That night, I wandered with nowhere to go. For 3 days, I drifted like a ghost through Riverside Park, my suitcase my only pillow, my stomach twisting with both hunger and the life growing inside me. By the third dawn, I no longer had tears left. My body ached, my spirit was nearly gone. It was then that I felt a gentle shake on my shoulder. I opened my eyes, expecting a police officer or perhaps some stranger who meant harm. Instead, I saw a woman in her 70s, wrapped in a wool coat, her eyes lined not only with age but with sorrow. She spoke softly, her voice carrying both firmness and compassion. "Child, you'll freeze to death out here." Her name was Margaret Rossi. A widow, she explained, who had walked this park every morning for years, ever since her husband passed. As she looked at me, her gaze shifted down toward my belly. She didn't need to ask questions. She already knew. Something flickered in her face, recognition mixed with grief. Later, I would learn she had lost her only daughter, Sophia, in a car accident 5 years earlier. Sophia had been expecting a child too. I tried to insist I was fine, though my chattering teeth betrayed me. Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she placed her coat over my shoulders and said words I'll never forget. "Come with me. My house has been waiting for someone like you." Her car smelled faintly of lavender and leather. For the first time in days, I felt heat on my skin, and I nearly cried from the relief of it. She drove us through quiet streets until we arrived at a large home on the west side, its windows glowing warm against the gray morning. Inside, Margaret led me down a hallway and opened a door. I froze. It was a nursery. A crib stood ready in the corner, toys neatly arranged, maternity clothes hanging in the closet with their tags still on. The room had been waiting, untouched, preserved. I turned to her, confused, my voice barely a whisper. Why would you give this to me?" Margaret's hand trembled as she touched a framed photograph on the dresser, a young woman with her same eyes, her same smile. "Because Sophia would have wanted me to," she said. "I lost a daughter. Perhaps God is giving me another chance to love one again." My composure shattered. I sank onto the bed and sobbed like a child. Margaret sat beside me, pulled me close, and held me as my own mother never had. Her embrace was not out of duty, not out of expectation. It was simply love. That night, I slept in a real bed for the first time since being cast out. Her little poodle, Max, curled at my feet as though guarding me. For the first time in days, I wasn't invisible. Life in Margaret's house was not charity, it was grace. She cooked breakfast and invited me to eat at her table, insisting, "You belong here now." When I tried to apologize for being a burden, she hushed me. "No apologies, Claire. We're family now, family." The word tasted foreign on my tongue, almost painful. Yet slowly, in the warmth of her home, it began to feel possible again. When my son Daniel was born that winter, a storm raged outside, but inside I was held safe. Margaret never left my side during labor. She whispered encouragement when I thought I couldn't go on. And when Daniel's first cry filled the room, she was the one who cut the cord and placed him in my arms. "He's brilliant," she declared, even though he was only minutes old, and somehow I believed her. I had entered Margaret's home as a broken girl. With her by my side, I began to feel like a mother, like a woman who might build a life from ashes. She didn't just give me shelter, she gave me dignity, she gave me hope. In that house, surrounded by warmth and lavender, I learned a truth I would carry forever. Sometimes strangers are the ones who save us, and sometimes family is chosen, not inherited. The winter Daniel was born, snow piled high against Margaret's wide windows. Inside her house, though, it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time since that night I had been cast out, I wasn't just surviving, I was beginning to live again. Daniel's cry in the middle of the night no longer frightened me. Margaret would sit at the edge of my bed, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, and whisper, "He's strong, Claire. You are too." It was her way of telling me that the life I had thought was ruined still held meaning. Those early years were exhausting. There were nights when Daniel screamed for hours, when my body ached from lack of sleep, when I wondered if I had the strength to keep going. But Margaret never let me fall. She rocked him when my arms trembled, sang to him when my voice broke, and reminded me, gently but firmly, that motherhood was not punishment. It was a calling. While I cared for Daniel, Margaret began teaching me in ways that stretched beyond diapers and bottles. She owned 3 restaurants in the city, each one thriving, each one a part of her late husband's dream. She could have hired managers to run them, but instead, she took me along. "You're not just working here," she said one afternoon as I nervously greeted customers from behind the hostess stand. "You're learning. One day, I want you to know how to build something of your own." At first I resisted. What did I know about profit margins or inventory? But Margaret had patience. She walked me through schedules, invoices, even late-night calculations at her dining room table. Slowly, the girl who had been given 10 minutes to erase her life began to discover she had skills and a future. Daniel grew in the middle of this rhythm, absorbing everything around him like sunlight. By 9 months, he was toddling across the kitchen floor. By 3, he was sitting at Margaret's table, turning pages of my anatomy textbooks and pointing at the pictures. I laughed, but Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Mark my words, Claire. That boy is destined for something extraordinary." She was right. By the time he was 10, Daniel was fascinated with the human body. He once took his teddy bear and, after watching a video, stitched a careful line across its stomach as though performing surgery. I remember watching him, needle in hand, and feeling both awe and fear, because in him I saw brilliance, but also a reminder of how cruel the world could be when brilliance came from the wrong place, the wrong blood. Still, I pressed forward. I earned my GED through night classes, studying while Daniel slept. Then I took online courses, building slowly toward a degree. Margaret cheered every small victory, placing certificates in frames on the wall as if they were priceless art. It was during one of those nights when Daniel was 16 and Harvard Medical had already accepted him that I met Richard Miller. He was the lawyer who helped Margaret update her will each year. Tall, steady, with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor, he didn't see me as a charity case. He saw me. The first time he stayed for coffee, Daniel sat across from him, rattling off his dream of becoming a surgeon. Richard listened carefully, nodding in admiration. Later, as we cleared the cups, he turned to me and said quietly, "Your son is remarkable. But so are you." Don't forget that I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the compliment. But something in his voice disarmed me. It had been nearly 20 years since a man had spoken to me with respect, with no agenda. That night after he left, I stood in the kitchen and let myself cry, not out of sadness, but out of the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being seen. As months passed, Richard became more than a visitor. He brought humor into our house, teasing Daniel about his stacks of medical journals, coaxing me to share stories I had long buried. Margaret adored him. "You can trust him," she whispered once, and her blessing carried the weight of truth. Yet even in this season of growth, a shadow lingered in me. Every success Daniel achieved, every step forward I took, was shadowed by the memory of that October night. I wondered if, someday, the past would come knocking. I wondered if those who had erased me would ever try to reclaim what they had lost. But in Margaret's house, with Daniel thriving and Richard slowly weaving himself into our lives, I allowed myself, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, to hope. Hope that I was not just surviving, but becoming the mother, the woman, and perhaps even the partner that I had once believed impossible. I thought I had buried the past. I thought Daniel's success would be ours alone to cherish, untouched by the shadows of my youth. But the past has a way of clawing its way back, especially when pride and greed are involved. It began the day the Springfield Gazette ran a front-page story. Youngest chief of cardiac surgery in state history. There was Daniel, only 20 years old, photographed in his scrubs, standing beneath the hospital's gleaming sign. The boy I once rocked to sleep now stood tall as a man, celebrated as a prodigy. My chest swelled with pride, yet even as I clipped the article for Margaret's old scrapbook, unease coiled in my stomach. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. I pressed play. "Claire, this is your mother." Her voice was older but no softer. "We need to talk about our grandson." Our grandson, not Daniel, not my son. Their words stripped him of his identity, reducing him to an asset they suddenly remembered. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but before I could, emails began arriving. Formal, polished, sent from the address of Thompson and Company. Industries, the empire my parents had always worshipped. "Dear Claire, recent news of Daniel's accomplishments has reached us. As his grandparents, we feel it is time to reconnect. Family bonds must not be neglected. Signed, Edward and Helen Thompson. Family bonds, the very ones they severed with cold signatures 20 years ago." Richard found me at my desk, tears burning my cheeks, not from sadness, but from rage. "They want him now," I whispered. "After decades of silence, they want to claim him." He knelt beside me, steady and calm. "Then let's remind them of what they signed." Elena, Margaret, prepared for this. He tapped the folder he always kept close, filled with the documents that safeguarded our lives. But my parents were not finished. They escalated, sending expensive packages addressed to Daniel at the hospital, a Rolex watch, a Montblanc pen, a first edition of Grey's Anatomy. Each note signed in flourish, "From your loving grandparents." Daniel came home bewildered, holding the gifts as if they were foreign objects. "Mom, someone keeps sending me these things. Should I be worried?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Return them. All of them." The final blow came not from my parents, but from Ethan. It was late at night when the call came. I almost didn't answer, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Claire, it's me. Please don't hang up." 20 years had passed since he had abandoned me, but still he spoke as if a single word could undo the damage. "I saw the news," he said. "Our son. He's incredible." Our son. My blood ran cold. He had forfeited that word the moment he vanished. "What do you want, Ethan?" I asked, my voice like stone. I want to know him. I was young. My parents pressured me. It wasn't fair. His excuses spilled out, flimsy and familiar. Then came the real truth. "Your parents contacted me. They think if I'm involved, you'll be more receptive. They've offered to help me financially if I can convince you." And there it was, the second betrayal, sharp as the first. Ethan had not only abandoned me, now he had sold himself as their accomplice. My parents and the boy who once swore forever had become partners in a scheme to reclaim what they had discarded, Daniel. I hung up before he could say more. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury. I called Richard immediately. "They're working together," I told him, "my parents and Ethan. They're planning this together." To my surprise, Richard didn't look alarmed. He almost smiled. "Good. Conspiracies leave evidence, and evidence leaves them powerless." He was right. The next morning, Ethan sent a long email outlining his father's rights. Carelessly, he copied my parents on it. At the bottom of his email, hidden in his signature, were the words that sealed their fate. Consultant, Thompson and Company. Family relations. They had actually hired him. My parents had hired the man who abandoned me to manipulate me into surrendering Daniel. When Richard read it, he nodded gravely. They just proved what Elena always said: family isn't blood. It's choice, and once choices are made, they can't be undone. For days, I couldn't look Daniel in the eye without fear that he would sense the storm building around us. He was so focused on his patients, so unaware of the vultures circling overhead. I wanted to protect him, to shield him forever, but Richard insisted the truth would need to be told, on our terms, not theirs. The memories of that October night flooded back. My father's cold voice, my mother's indifference, Ethan's silence. The wounds had never truly healed, but now they burned fresh, as though 20 years had been only a moment. I had been betrayed twice then, and now I was betrayed twice over again. But this time I was no longer a terrified 17-year-old girl. I was a mother. I was a woman who had rebuilt from ashes. And if they thought they could steal what Margaret and I had fought to preserve, they would learn that some bonds cannot be broken, not by signatures, not by greed, not by betrayal. The ghosts of my past had returned, but this time I was ready to face them. The Springfield Memorial Gala was the kind of evening my parents had always worshipped. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, 500 of the city's most powerful gathered in one glittering room. But this year, the spotlight did not belong to them. It belonged to my son. Daniel was the keynote speaker, invited to honor his groundbreaking work in cardiac surgery. He insisted on wearing his scrubs instead of a tuxedo, a quiet statement that he was there as a doctor, not as a showpiece. I stood near the back of the ballroom, heart swelling as I watched him adjust the microphone. At table 1, positioned front and center, sat my parents, Edward and Helen Thompson, dressed to impress as though they had never erased me. Pearls gleamed at my mother's throat. My father's tie bore the Harvard crest. Beside them sat Ethan, stiff in a rented tuxedo, his eyes darting nervously toward the stage. They looked, for all the world, like a family proud of their rising star. But I knew the truth, and so did Richard, standing beside me with a folder under his arm. The murmurs in the room quieted as Daniel began. His voice carried steady, but full of feeling. "Good evening. Tonight I want to talk about family. Not the kind written in bloodlines or carved on a family tree, but the kind that shows up when you're most alone." The ballroom hushed. My parents' smiles tightened. Daniel went on, sharing the story of a 17-year-old girl cast out into the night, abandoned by those who should have protected her. He spoke of how a stranger, a widow named Margaret Rossi, opened her home and heart, becoming the grandmother he had always known. Behind him, the screen lit up with Margaret's photograph. Her smile radiant, her eyes kind. Gasps rippled through the crowd. At table 1, my mother shifted uncomfortably. My father's jaw clenched, Ethan's face drained of color. Then Daniel's voice softened. Everything I am today, I owe to 2 women, my mother, Claire Thompson, who gave up everything for me, and my grandmother, Margaret Rossi, who showed us what family truly means. The audience erupted in applause. My parents did not clap. Ethan stared at the floor. When the applause subsided, Richard stepped forward. His voice was calm but resolute as he opened the folder. "Ladies and gentlemen, there are documents you deserve to see." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind Daniel changed. First appeared the signatures, Edward and Helen Thompson, on a legal document dated 20 years ago, relinquishing all parental rights to me and any children I might bear. Gasps filled the room as Richard read the words aloud. My mother's face blanched, my father's fists clenched the tablecloth. Then came the emails, projected in 40-foot letters, Ethan Blake corresponding with my parents, calling Daniel an asset to be recovered, bargaining for money in exchange for manipulating me. My son's life reduced to currency. Murmurs turned to outrage as the crowd digested the betrayal. And finally, Margaret's recorded message. Her voice filled the ballroom, strong even through the haze of illness that had claimed her in the end. "You abandoned a treasure. I found her. She became my daughter. Daniel became my grandson. And you? You are nothing but signatures on a page." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to table 1. My mother trembled. My father's face purpled with fury. Ethan's hands shook as he tried to hide his face. I rose from my seat then, my voice carrying across the hall without need of a microphone. "You gave me 10 minutes to stop being your daughter. Tonight, I give you 10 minutes to stop pretending you're my family." The silence was deafening, and for the first time I did not feel like the frightened girl of 17. I felt like a woman standing in the truth, unbroken, unafraid. The gala ended not with champagne toasts, but with silence heavier than marble. My parents left flanked by security, their faces pale under the chandeliers that once symbolized their power. Ethan trailed behind, shoulders slumped, his carefully rehearsed lies collapsing under the weight of truth. For the first time in 20 years, I felt the chains of their shadow break. The days that followed brought headlines. Family empire exposed in betrayal. Parents who erased their daughter now shut out forever. Their company's stock plummeted, their reputations soured. I watched from the quiet of our kitchen, Daniel sipping tea beside me, Richard stacking Margaret's old recipe cards into neat piles. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not loud. It was steady, undeniable, and strangely peaceful. But the sweetest justice was not their downfall. It was what came next. Richard and I launched the Margaret Rossi Foundation, seeded with her legacy and Daniel's vision. The goal was simple but urgent, to ensure no young mother ever spent a night on a park bench as I had. Housing, childcare, scholarships, hope woven into every corner. At the dedication ceremony, Daniel spoke with the same steady voice he had used at the gala. "This is for my grandmother Margaret," he said, "and for every mother who chooses love when the world chooses shame." One evening, weeks later, as we gathered around Margaret's old dining table, Daniel carved a roast the way she had once taught him. Candlelight flickered across his tired but determined face. "Mom," he said softly, "I met a girl at the hospital today." 17. She was sleeping in her car with her baby. I told her about the foundation. She moves in tomorrow. My chest tightened, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. The cycle was broken. What had nearly destroyed me was now saving others. That night, Richard reached across the table, his hand warm over mine. "Claire, we've built something Margaret would be proud of. But I'd like to build the rest of my life with you, too." His words caught me off guard. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered yes. Daniel clapped, laughing, his joy echoing through the house that had once been filled with silence. We toasted with Margaret's crystal glasses, her portrait smiling down from the wall. In that moment, I knew family had nothing to do with bloodlines. Family was presence. Family was choice. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that family is chosen, not forced, I invite you to subscribe and share. Somewhere tonight, a young woman may be sitting alone, wondering if she matters. Let's make sure she knows she does. For the first time in 2 decades, I felt completely free. Free of their judgment, free of their silence, free to choose love every single day. And as laughter filled Margaret's house once more, I knew this was family, real, permanent, and mine.